Hello, and welcome to our junior church lesson for today. As we get into the lesson for today, I want to remind you of what we're coming into. Today we'll be looking at 2 Kings chapter 4. But before we do that, I want to give a background going into 2 Kings chapter 4. In chapter 2, Elijah and Elisha were having their communion together. They were talking about what they were going to do. Elijah was about ready to go home to heaven by way of a whirlwind. Elisha kept following him to everywhere else. And the sons of the prophets were trying to tell Elisha, hey, your master's going home today. Don't you know that? And they kept bugging him about that. And if you also remember, Elijah was taken out. And before that, Elisha had asked for a double portion of his spirit. So that way God can work through each and every single one of them. And through Elisha himself. So Elijah said, if you see me take up, then you will have that answer. It was a hard thing for him to do. But sure enough, Elijah was blown up with a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha had mourned for his loss. But sure enough, God had answered that prayer. But the sons of the prophets, they were like, hey, you're mad. I think we need to go find Elijah because he's been blown away. And Elisha said he's gone. He's not even on the face of this earth. But sure enough, they were like, no. He got blown away like a tornado. So they searched for him 3 days. But obviously, it wasn't found because Elijah was no longer here. So he gets taken away. And they realize that Elisha is now the new man of God, the prophet of God. And then children mocked him. And Elisha had the bears come out and give him a bit of a punishment because they were mocking the man of God. Chapter 3 goes into a bunch of legal issues about being rebuked and a rebellion that takes place, Moab being defeated. But now in chapter 4, we want to begin the storyline for today. In the first 7 verses, we see almost the same parallel from when Elijah had been taken himself, had this same situation with a widow. Except in Elijah's case, if you remember, that he was asked to go there during a drought, and sure enough, the lady said, hey, it's just for me and my son. We're going to eat and we're going to die. And Elijah said, hey, make it for me first and God will bless you. Well, Elisha now comes into a similar situation with the widow here. First, 2 Kings chapter 4 and verse 1. Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elijah, saying, thy servant, my husband, is dead. And now knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord. Of course, make it sound spiritual. And the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. Now, being a widow, if you remember, children, and how as we've talked about in previous weeks, it wasn't the easiest thing to do. You couldn't do a lot of things. And because of that, if they had lost their husbands, it would be pretty hard for them to be able to sustain everything. So Elisha tries to figure out what's going on here. She says, hey, there's only a pot of oil left. That's all we have. So then verse 3, he said, go borrow the vessels abroad of all thy neighbors. So he says, hey, get all the buckets you can, all the barrels that you can, and we're going to see something happen here. So sure enough, they fetched them. They listened. This one listened better than the other widow did, if you want to compare the two together. But then, verse 6, came to pass when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, there is not a vessel more. And the oil stayed. Now that was encouraging to this widow. Because not only that, he said in verse 7, go sell the oil, pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children of the rest. God was able to use Elisha for this miracle, for this purpose, to be able to have this widow have this oil. But as we continue on with the story here, children, we now go to another aspect of the story. Now, this is where we get this idea of housing the people and the men of God and the families of God who travel. In verse 8 of 2 Kings 4, it says, "It fell on a day when Elisha passed to Shunem, where was a great woman, and she constrained him to eat bread. And so it was, as often as he passed by, he turned in thither to eat bread." Every time Elisha was going through this town of Shunem, this lady comes along and says, "Hey, let's have some food." And every time he passed through, whether he was going one way or going through the other way, he said, "Hey, let's go have some food." And she treated him very well. She was what you would call hospitable. Now, what is hospitality? What is being hospitable? Think that to yourselves and see if you can get an answer. Hospitable would be able to help out others, to care for others, to reach out and be loving toward one another. And that's what being hospitable is. And this lady was, her and her husband here, verse 9. She said to her husband, "Behold, now I perceive that this is a holy man of God, which passeth by us continuously. Let us make a little chamber, I pray thee, on a wall, and let us set for him there a bed, and a table, and a stool, and a candlestick. And it shall be that when he cometh to us, he shall turn in thither." So they created what we would call today the prophet's chamber, where as a traveling preacher comes, the family would take them in. Today, churches do that in aspects where they have the capabilities to do that. And they house them there to be able to keep them instead of having to use expenses elsewhere. So, every time he came through, he was able to lay there. He called his right-hand man, Gehazi. I want you to remember Gehazi, because Gehazi is going to come up very important in this chapter, and more importantly, in the next chapter when we talk about it next week. But Gehazi is told to bring this lady to her, to Elisha. And sure enough, he says, "Hey, you've treated me so faithful. You've treated me so kind. There's something I have to do." And he kept thinking about it. In verse 14, Gehazi says at the end of verse 14, "Verily she hath no child, and her husband is old." So he says, "I know what we'll do. We're going to tell her that she's going to have a child. The Shunammite lady is going to have her own son." And verse 16, she's like, "I don't think this is going to happen." Verse 16, about this season, "According to the time of life, thou shalt embrace the son." And she said, "Nay, my Lord, thou man of God, do not lie to thy handmaid." She thought, "Hey, there's no way I'm going to have a child. My husband is old. There's just no way it's going to happen." But sure enough, it happened. The following verse explains that to us. But with all the blessings that has happened with this lady, with all the things that we've seen so far in this chapter, we've seen that a widow was able to be sustained with her children and have oil to pay her debts. This lady's caring for Elisha and Gehazi, and all that's taken place. But tragedy strikes. And that's in verse number 18 and 19 and 20. "And when the child was grown, it fell on a day." So it's been a few years. Don't know how many. Maybe as a teenager, maybe as an early adult. We don't really know. He went out to his father to the reapers, and he said to his father, my head. And he said to the lad, "Carry him to his mother." And when they had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon, and then died. How tragic. Son passes away. Something that she's probably always wanted, but she couldn't. And at that point, her husband wasn't able to give that to her. But now she finally got it, but now he's gone. This lady goes into a determined mode here. She realizes, hey, I need to figure out something. And she tries to seek out the answers. So sure enough, she asks her husband for some donkeys, some animals to ride upon. And she takes her way up. And she just says, hey, I don't care if I get tired. I want you to find a man of God for me. Now that's important to know. Is that sometimes when people are depressed, when people get discouraged, They want to give up on God, but yet she decided not to. And that's something that you and I can think about. When things go wrong, isn't God still there for us? I would think so. I know so. So she travels on, and she gets to Mount Carmel where Elisha is at. She gets to where Gehazi is at. Gehazi recognizes that she's coming down the way here, and Elisha sends him out. Verse 27. And when she came to the man of God to the hill, she caught him by the feet, but Gehazi came near to thrust her away. She was overwhelmed with emotion. That's quite honest in this passage here. She was overwhelmed. But you know what? Elisha understood what was going on here. So he told Gehazi, let go. Don't let her let her be. Let her do what she needs to do. So she says, verse 28, did I desire a son of my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? And essentially she says, hey, I thought everything was good. I thought everything was right. So they decide to go back to the house. And they come back to the house. Gehazi comes along. He sends Gehazi out first, says, hey, if anyone salutes you, don't stop, don't do anything. You have a singular focus, get to that house. Take my staff, get there, lay it upon the kid. I will get there, and we'll do what God wants us to do. So sure enough, Gehazi moves on down to the house. The child's mother follows along with Elisha. Gehazi doesn't realize that it doesn't stop for anybody, but he also realizes that the child is indeed dead. In verse 31. 32, and when Elisha was come into the house, behold, the child was dead and laid upon his bed. So Elisha goes. He realizes again, like she said, that the child is no longer here. So he lays himself upon the child. He prays and asks the child and prays for God for healing, for the child to be awakened again. Verse 35, and he returned and walked into the house to and fro, and went up and stretched himself upon him. And the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. And he said, and he called Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite. And he called her. And when she was come in unto him, he said, take up thy son. And she went in, fell at his feet, bowed herself to the ground, took up her son, and went out. Now Elisha would do 2 other miracles at the end of this chapter here. One with pottage and fruits and herbs and stuff and things like that. But what I want us to understand here today, boys and girls, as you're watching this today, I want you to understand 2 things. One, and this is something that we've kind of been talking about quite a bit, is that God's in control. God's in control no matter what the situation is. We may not understand all the answers. I still don't understand all the answers at 32 years old. We don't know. We don't know what tomorrow is going to hold. We don't know what 10 days are going to hold from now. We don't know what 2 hours is going to hold from now. But understand this, boys and girls, God's in control. Again, we may not see it like a fast food mentality. We have to be quick, quick, quick. Sometimes it's going to be that slow and steady wins the race. And secondly, we see that faithfulness is rewarded. The widow listened and obeyed Elisha, got what they needed, and they were able to pay off their debts. The Shunammite lady fed him, fed Elisha, fed Gehazi, had a place for him to sleep at. God blessed him with the child, and she still kept her faith, even in that tragedy. And God was able to bring her son back to life again. We learned that we ought to be faithful, and we learned that God's in control. Lord willing, next week we'll be looking at Gehazi again and Elisha, but we're going to be looking at something that's a little too big for Gehazi, and we see some greed that comes into play. But we're going to stop there for today. Thank you all for watching this video, and I hope that you're able to listen to this, children, and be able to encourage yourself through this. And even though you may not be able to be here in church this morning, that you still can stay faithful to the Word of God, that you can be here and be able to still read the Word daily, even if it's 10 verses a day, chapter a day. And we're praying for everything and pray for healing.